Capitalism, said John Maynard Keynes, is the astounding belief that the most wickedest of men will do the most wickedest of things for the greater good of everyone. Or, in the slightly more prosaic words of my 13-year-old daughter, capitalists think that poor people should have less money and pay more taxes than rich people. I'm not entirely sure, but I think she probably didn't get that from the GCSE syllabus. I should tell you something about Tilly, because when she was a little bit younger, she suffered from a mild childhood epilepsy, and this left her seeing things that weren't there. Or to be more precise, seeing things that other people couldn't see, including me. And that's how it was with the taxes, because that's what I thought it was, just a childhood epilepsy thing, until I actually looked at the data and discovered that it's true that in this country, poor people pay more gross tax as a proportion of their income than rich people do. And here's some evidence that's been teased by the Equality Trust out of the ONS's labyrinthine website. Has anyone tried to use that thing? They should have just asked Tilly. The simple belief that selfishness is not just a virtue, but the primary virtue can be found at the heart of every economic institution in modern capitalism. The regressive tax system, the bonuses of bankers, the hedge fund rape and pillage of sovereign debt in countries like Argentina, the obscene rates of interest charged by payday loan sharks to the most vulnerable in society. And when things go bad and get bad, as they did 5 years ago, all there is on offer really is just more of the same, withdrawing vital social investments in the name of austerity, and at the same time propping up the balance sheets of the banks and lining the pockets of the architects of chaos, all in the name of recovery. It's something that we should, I think, feel angry about. But we also have to sometimes shelve that anger, put it to one side, because anger left uncontained can be a quite destructive force, particularly when we have little in the way of understanding from which to build alternatives. And that's why, in my work, I've tried to penetrate, if you like, what we could call the soft underbelly of capitalism, trying to understand its inner emotions. And for my sins, I've also used the thing that Kate told us we shouldn't use. I use it to explore how important savings is, for example, and the importance of productivity, and how actually it's really hard to employ people when the economy goes bad. And I use it too to point out the extraordinary role that novelty seeking plays in the capitalist economy. How the restless innovation of the entrepreneur is the perfect match for our own insatiable desire for new stuff, and how these twin forces actually propel capitalism towards a continual, relentless expansion of consumer demand, and of course, as Kate pointed out, the material throughput as well. But I want tonight really just to point to one aspect of this system, a rather strange one, and it's the role that anxiety plays in it. This is a system that thrives on anxiety. The anxiety of the entrepreneur is the risk, the fear of capital flight. Innovate or die is the maxim of the market. And the anxiety inside us is a deeper thing, an anxiety about doing well and being seen to do well in society, what Adam Smith called the desire to live a life without shame. And then beyond that desire to live a life without shame, a deeper, more existential anxiety that actually all our striving, all our best efforts will ultimately result in nothing. But it's not just an abstract anxiety, this thing. It's somehow embedded in the fabric of our lives. There was another occasion, it was a few years ago. Tilly, I think, was about 4 or 5, and it was a Sunday, and I was renewing the insulation around the kitchen door, pressing thin strips of adhesive-backed foam into the corners of the door jamb to keep out the drafts. And Tilly was helping me in the way that only 5-year-olds can, wanting to hold something and cut something and looking at me with her big moon eyes. And very solemnly, after a few minutes, she asked me, "Daddy, can this really keep out the giraffes?" You can hear the 5-year-old mind working. How did these giraffes get in our back garden? What are they doing there? Will they still be there on Monday when I have to go to school? Will I be able to stroke them, or will they tangle me up in their long, gangly legs? Will they try and eat me? I assured Tilly that, of course, giraffes were strictly vegetarian and were really very gentle creatures. And at first, of course, I put down this whole giraffe thing, as I did with the taxis, to childhood epilepsy. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized, the more I understood that, in fact, Tilly was absolutely right. The giraffes really were in the garden. And it really mattered to keep them out of the kitchen. And in fact, we spend a whole huge amount of energy and time throughout our whole lives in exactly this task of trying to keep order in our world. Getting our kids to school on time, getting to work ourselves on time, coping with office politics and email overload, and then foraging for groceries and throwing together meals, and escaping for a couple of hours into World Cup football or primetime television, getting from one end of the day to the other end of the day and keeping out the giraffes. And that isn't, of course, all there is to it. Our lives routinely rise above the routine, and the daily grind is lifted from obscurity by our continual craving for a better life for us and for our children. And from the loose fabric of routine and the radiant colors of desire, we somehow manage to face our anxiety and construct a sense of meaning and purpose in the world, sometimes against the most considerable odds. My son was absolutely perfect when he was born. I remember in particular the kind of translucent quality of his skin across his tiny chest. At 6 weeks old, a vigilant nurse heard a murmur that was coming from his heart. This perfect son, this perfect child, had somehow arrived on planet Earth with a tiny, tiny defect. Several weeks, numerous consultations, whole mountains of anxiety later, I found myself in the small room of the consultant surgeon who explained to me what would need to happen next. It's a very routine operation, he said to me. We will sew a tiny piece of Gore-Tex into Zach's heart. And over time, the tissues will actually grow into this Gore-Tex, so that if you went looking for it, you probably wouldn't even find it. And eventually, he will have, to all intents and purposes, he will have a normal heart. I remember not just anxiety, I remember visceral fear that this most precious thing could actually be taken away from me. And actually, even in the most optimistic outcome, that this perfect translucent skin would be scarred for life. And I wondered if it was down to me actually to be absolutely sure that this was the right thing to do. Should we really operate on this child? He's so young, I said. Couldn't we wait until the hole began to close? And the surgeon just shook his head and he said, no, the heart will become less and less efficient. The lungs will have to work faster and faster. You may not notice initially, but one day he won't be doing sport at school anymore. And very soon after that, he will find it difficult to walk. And by the age of 20 or 25, he will be facing a lung and heart transplant if he wants to just survive. It wasn't until he stood up that I noticed that this surgeon was actually very, very small. And as he extended his hand to shake mine, how childlike, how delicate, how tiny his hands were. And that was the point at which I decided actually it was going to be all right. That if anyone was going to bust open the chest and tinker with the heart of my perfect son, then this man with his very small hands was the one to do it. And I counted myself lucky that he was there, because not long ago, he wouldn't have been. In the cold rain and the biting wind of Malvern in April, on St. George's Day in 1851, there is another father sitting at the deathbed of his 10-year-old daughter Annie, weeping inconsolably, unable to come to terms with what he later described as an insufferable grief at Annie's loss. That man's name was Charles Darwin, and in the aftermath of Annie's death, his wife, Emma, was quite a religious person. She turned to religion for her consolation, but Charles turned away from religion. Annie's death simply served to reduce any sense that Charles had of a belief in a just universe, and to cement his idea of the underlying cruelty of nature. And he threw himself from that point onwards with a passion into his life's work, which of course was the most influential theory, one of the most influential theories of the last 200 years, a theory in which suffering and selfishness and cruelty are the engine of evolutionary progress. And a theory in which, in addition, actually, in fact, God, as Nietzsche later declared, was dead. And where there had been a God, a cause, a faith in a just universe, there was now an utter void, as George Bernard Shaw once said. Chaos had come back. At first, the effect of this was exhilarating, said Shaw. We had the runaway child's sense of freedom before it becomes lonely and hungry and frightened. Now, I'm not a religious person at all. I suppose I would, if you pushed me, describe myself as a kind of devout agnostic. And I'm certainly not trying to suggest a religious revival. The fundamentalism of 21st century religion actually terrifies me, even though it becomes understandable in the context of the moral failures of capitalism. But what I do want to suggest is a kind of a parallel between religious consolation and consumer capitalism. Anxiety itself, of course, is everywhere. It's not specific to capitalism. But what's at stake is our ability, our success or failure in navigating that anxiety and in creating a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives. And capitalism's answer to that is a very, very seductive one, a kind of materialistic cornucopia. Today is a brighter, shinier place than yesterday, and tomorrow will be a brighter and shinier place again. And the lure of continual novelty actually speaks to us of a kind of immortality. The human animal is a beast that dies, says Big Daddy in Tennessee Williams' wonderful play, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. And if he's got money, he buys and buys and buys. And I think one of the reasons he buys everything he can is that in the back of his mind is the crazy hope that one of his purchases will be life everlasting. It's obvious that this is a false promise. It's obvious that it's nuts. It's obvious that actually in pursuing this promise, we're busy destroying the environment and undermining hope and destroying our future prosperity. It's clear that capitalism papers over the cracks of our anxiety and causes deep rifts in our meaning structures. But the good news is how much room there is for hope, how much room there is for change, armed with this understanding, because it turns out, of course, that in fact, it was never actually all about selfishness and stuff. It was instead about story, about our position in the world, about our concern, our deep, abiding concern, our anxiety for other people. I like occasionally to take my kids into the wild, or something like the wild, usually the Lake District. We saw these giraffes, in fact, in the Lake District, and I took this picture when we were there. I like to think this was an example of what George calls rewilding, reintroducing wild animals into the countryside, but sadly, these giraffes were horribly captive. I have no idea what they made of the Lake District weather. Captive too were the hordes of fractious children and slightly anxious parents traipsing through narrow pathways, desperate for a glimpse of the wild, before being shepherded carefully into the visitors' centre, as it's euphemistically called, and persuaded to spend money they don't have on things they don't need for children that they love just a little bit too much. I went there with my kids, and I bought this. And I swore never to go back there again. And for most of the time, actually, now we spend almost all of the time in the open air, sitting by streams, building dams, reading books, plunging into ice-cold lakes, climbing, whatever there is to climb, everything in sight, happier than we ever imagined we could be without a capitalist in sight. Zach, with his, to all intents and purposes, normal heart, is always the first to reach the top of anything. And Tilly still sees things that other people just can't see. Thank you very much.